Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Makdisi Street. I'm delighted to be back with my brothers Sari and Karim, and with our incredible guest, Professor Abdel Razzaq Takriti. Before I introduce Abid, I'd like to remind all our viewers and listeners to please subscribe, like, and give a 5-star review on any platform that you're listening to this. And if you are so inclined, to subscribe to our Patreon feed, because that helps our show, it helps defray the costs, and above all, it helps circulate the show far and wide. Our special guest today is none other than our dear friend and colleague, Professor Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who is, of course, the Arab American Educational Foundation Chair of Arab Studies at Rice University. Abid is also, I think, the foremost historian of our time of anti-colonialism, revolutions, intellectual and political currents, and state formations in the modern Arab world. Abid is also the author of an extraordinary book called Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, 1965 to 1976, which was initially published by Oxford University Press and which has an Arabic edition. Professor Takriti is also the co-author with Karma Nabulsi of the digital humanities project called the Palestine Liberation, which is an online website. He's published extensively, and most notably in the American Historical Review and in Radical History Review. Abid is one of those rare historians who is utterly bilingual in both Arabic and English, and he has spent his entire career, after receiving his doctorate at Oxford, in sort of mining and archiving and bringing back to light a history that we're going to talk about today of anti-colonialism and of revolutions and the revolutionary tradition in the Arab world. Before arriving at Rice, Abid was the founding director of the Arab American Educational Foundation Center of Arab Studies at the University of Houston, where he was also the Arab American Educational Foundation Professor of History there. And in 2022-2023, he served as the Mahmoud Darwish Visiting Chair in Palestinian Studies at Brown University. Abid, we're really delighted to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Osama. Thank you, Sari, and thank you, Karim, for the wonderful invitation. And I'm a big fan of this podcast, so I look forward to having this conversation with you all.
Okay, fantastic. Abid, so we always begin by asking our guests sort of a biographical question. How did Abid Takriti, in this instance, how did you become the historian that you are? And can you just give us a sense of why you chose to focus on what you focus on, and just a general biographical sense and sketch?
Well, I was born in a period in which the Palestinian and Arab communities, both in the Middle East and elsewhere, were subjected to a horrendous set of assaults. I mean, I was born in the early 80s. That was a time when a major Arab capital, Beirut, fell under Israeli occupation. It was a time when you had a total disintegration of the region. You had the Iran-Iraq war. You had the collapse of any form of unified Arab front around the question of Palestine as a result of the post-Camp David Accords period. You had a general situation in the global South, where countries were facing serious political and economic dilemmas. And growing up in that environment, while at the same time inheriting a rich tradition of Arab radical scholarship and thought, as a nerdy kid that used to read a lot of these books in Arabic, I was well aware that there were better periods. There was a different tradition out there. We did have a very strong anti-colonial moment. There was a promise of liberation that had existed before. And really, I think most of my career, both as a scholar and as an organizer, was dedicated to not only trying to recover that tradition, but to find new emancipatory horizons.
So, Abid, if I could just begin. So, of course, we're recording this in the midst of a horrific genocide in Gaza. We're now more than 8 months into this genocide, massacres every week. The extraordinary, like, just it's an or like unbelievable situation that we're all sort of affected by. We of course hope that you don't have family in Gaza.
No, I've never had family in Gaza.
You have a lot of friends, of course, and colleagues there, and people you know. And so the question, Abed, is given what's going on now in Gaza, and given the whole sort of the history of the current present that we have, what is the importance to your mind? How do you link the kind of work, the history, and the political history in particular of Palestine? Why is it important, and how does it help us understand and frame for our listeners and viewers what's going on now in Gaza?
Well, first of all, what's going on in Gaza now is a continuation, of course, of what has been happening in Palestine for the past century. It's a situation of an ongoing colonial continuum whose end result or objective is the destruction of the Palestinian people and really their replacement by another group of people, a group of settler colonists. Now, what we have witnessed in Gaza, though, is really an unleashing of the most horrific aspects of settler colonialism. And we've seen that in other settler colonial projects before, where once you have the settler colonial group feeling that it's on the defensive, it goes really, really vicious. And in this case, it's gone genocidal. And I would say this, of course, there are some progressive lone voices here and there within Israeli society, but they're far and few in between. And unfortunately, the overall trend wants the destruction of Palestine and the Palestinian people, which is a very sad reality, but it is the truth. And we have a lot of work to do to try to stop that. I should say that as a historian, I'm very cognizant of the fact that this is also an internationally authorized genocide. In the same way that Palestine was quite unique in that it was an internationally authorized case of settler colonization, as in it was a case of settler colonization that depended on authorization of the new bodies that were created in the 20th century, supposedly to promote peace, but really that was an inter-imperialist peace that they were trying to promote. And there was an imperial power consensus on setting up a settler colonial order in Palestine. And our people paid the price for that. And now they continue to pay the price for it. Because look at what's happening today in Gaza. And I know you guys have been talking about it a lot, both in your individual capacities, but also through this podcast. What we're seeing is an international crime. This is an internationally sanctioned genocide. And despite the fact that it goes against every law, every notion of humanity, every concept of self-respect, dignity, liberation, but it's still happening. So we have to talk about it, and I'm really glad to be given this platform to discuss it.
Abid, in the history of the Zionist conflict with the Palestinian people, the Zionist project in Palestine was originally more of an eliminationist, like any settler colonial movement. It has a kind of eliminationist logic to it, and some settler colonial projects are more, from the beginning, initially genocidal, exterminationist, like the one in Australia or the one in North America. Whereas this particular settler colonial project didn't begin as a genocidal project. It began as an eliminationist project, right, to get rid of the natives, to use the Zionist term from the 1920s to transfer the native population, as Herzl says in one of his things, to spirit the penniless population across the border, yani to get rid of the indigenous Palestinian people and obviously replace them with a newly, with new immigrants from Europe. But in what we're seeing in Gaza today, clearly something has shifted in the Zionist logic, right? It's gone from what had been an eliminationist logic activated through transfer, removal, ethnic cleansing and so forth, to a properly full-scale genocidal project, one of actual just full-on genocide, as in Conrad's line, exterminate the brutes. I mean, that's kind of the logic we're seeing now in Gaza. We have been seeing for the previous 9 months. So, because what we're seeing represents a qualitative and a quantitative shift from earlier expressions of Zionist violence against the Palestinians, and again, we've all witnessed, we've all experienced, to some extent, Israeli violence against Palestinians, but nothing that we have experienced, nothing that we've seen in our collective history is anything like what we're seeing now. I mean, for example, the massacres in 1948, most infamously Deir Yassin or Tantura, places like that. I mean, how many people did they kill? 200 or 300, which is not to minimize them, of course, but that's a day in Gaza times 9 months, obviously, right? So something qualitatively and quantitatively has shifted in the mentality in the collective mentality of Zionism. So how do you explain this shift from a logic of settler colonial eliminationism through transfer and ethnic cleansing to a settler colonial logic of elimination through outright genocide at this point? How do you explain what triggered this switch in Zionist thinking?
Well, I think, first of all, that if we look at global settler colonialism, it operates in accordance with different logics in different spaces. So you're right to think of places like Australia and the so-called Western Hemisphere, Turtle Island. These places were subjected to a genocidal exterminationist project very early on. But these were places where the settler colonists were acquiring territory on a continental scale. In the case of Afro-Asian settler colonial models, they've operated a little bit differently. For example, in places like South Africa, of course, the intention was to exploit native labor, and that meant some elimination from certain areas, some extermination in other areas. But the overall intention was domination and labor extraction and control. I mean, similarly in Algeria. So there's a spectrum available for settler colonial forces, that ranges from elimination to extermination, and could include also domination in some cases. In the case of Palestine, we've seen a hybrid model where different elements have been applied, actually, sometimes simultaneously. So what we're seeing, for example, now in Palestine is an exterminationist logic operating in Gaza, an eliminationist logic operating across the board everywhere. And they're not mutually exclusive, by the way, and I think they've never been under genocide and genocidal regimes. There's always been elements of both. I think there's a misunderstanding of the history of genocides, sometimes amongst the general public, where they think it means just exterminating everybody immediately. There was always a potential for elimination. There were always different tools available for those committing genocide. In this case, they're definitely committing genocide in Gaza. They're killing a huge number of people, as you've noted. They're also trying to destroy the capacity at society reproducing itself, which is an important component of genocide. We know that when genocide actually was first developed as a concept, it was developed with an eye towards also thinking about how collective groups are targeted as groups. The intention is for them not to be able to reproduce themselves culturally, politically, educationally, to not be able to reproduce themselves as people. So that's definitely what we're seeing in Gaza today. The objective is to render Gaza uninhabitable. And that's been declared over and over and over again. And that's at the heart of this genocide. Now, why did they have to go down this route, this exterminationist route? It's because the eliminationist option is not fully open to them for geostrategic reasons. Egypt does not want to absorb a new huge wave of Palestinian refugees for its own reasons, not because the Egyptian regime is kind towards the Palestinian people, but because it sees that it will have a problem to deal with in Sinai and it will have to deal with internal regime dynamics that could threaten the very presence and of that regime. So there are issues there. Similarly, when it comes to the West Bank, Jordan does not want to absorb a new huge wave of Palestinian refugees. So the options that are available for those in power in the Israeli settler colonial regime today are either extermination or to try to create a situation where the surrounding countries are put under enormous pressure to accept elimination through a new wave of ethnic cleansing. And they're pursuing both objectives, of course, with the support of the US and the major Western powers.
Yeah, thank you, Abed. I think soon we're going to get into the questions of, Palestinian national politics and questions of resistance. But I want to just again, for our listeners, for everybody, you mentioned the question of international responsibility, international crimes enabling genocide today in Gaza, and of course making the point that this is part of this much larger history that you and others, as historians have studied. Can you give us an idea of, today we're looking at Anthony Blinken and people like this who are, on the one hand, denying what the Israelis are doing and somehow still blaming those that are under apartheid conditions, under occupation, and now under genocide, blaming them as the victims for their own genocide. What was the situation in the 20s and 30s and 40s when you had these kinds of international authorities also enabling Nakba, enabling these other kinds of crimes that were happening? Who were the Anthony Blinkens then, and how do we, as non-historians, look at them, and where do we see these sources?
Well, I think this is a very important question, Kareem, because sometimes people tend to look at structural forces and they don't talk about the individual characters, and both are important. So it's not enough to talk about imperialism. It's also important to call out the people who are behind it and who have pushed very hard to impose that particular form of imperialism on Palestine. And that's both for reasons of historical accountability, but also to understand how imperialism functions and how settler colonialism functions. These are policies that are made by people who are grounded in social and political movements. Now, I am fully convinced that Zionism is a political and social movement and should be understood as such. It's a political and social movement in the West that has deep roots in various countries, that had active people that were pursuing it. It goes beyond the question of lobbying that people usually tend to focus on. It's much bigger than that. Lobbying is just one aspect of it. It has to do with cultural factors, intellectual factors, religious factors, and also the political balance of power prevailing in each space that we're discussing. Now, the space that matters the most to us in the case of Zionism in the early part of the 20th century was Britain, of course. And there you had vicious racist characters like Balfour, who was also happened to be, by the way, anti-Semitic, but more importantly in this case, very anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian. And for him, he articulated very clearly a vision for the Jews of Europe in which they no longer reside in Europe. In his introduction to Sokolov's History of Zionism, he makes clear that his vision was that Jews were not able to assimilate into Europe, and maybe he didn't even want them to assimilate into Europe. He certainly did not want them to exist as a separate cultural and religious group in Europe, unless they subscribe to the overall dominant culture. He spoke about these things in civilizational terms, and he saw the solution, the removal of Jews from Europe as a solution. That's why he was a big proponent of the Uganda plan. Later on, he took a step back from it, and actually, that was because Chaim Weizmann convinced him to take a step back from that and to refocus on Palestine. So he's part of that trend, but there were many others. Lloyd George was culturally, very much socialized into Zionism. His cultural references and religious references were very much pushing him in that direction. And at the end of the day, what's very important when we look at the British War Cabinet that made the decision to pass the Balfour Declaration. I hear a lot of talk, especially from Zionists, where they say, if Zionism didn't exist, they would have had to invent it, and that it was all a geostrategic game to try to gain control over the Suez Canal. It doesn't make sense. When you go through the actual documents or what survives from the deliberations around the Balfour Declaration, by the way, not much survives, and that's a very interesting, and an important note. The fact that many of these documents have disappeared. But when you look at the deliberations that we have from the War Cabinet around the Balfour Declaration, what you see is a discussion that is almost entirely focused on religious and cultural factors. There's very little geostrategy mentioned there, which is quite astonishing. I mean, and I would advise our listeners to check, for example, the very interesting response that was given to the claims of those that were pushing for the Balfour Declaration in the War Cabinet by the only Jewish member of the War Cabinet, Lord Montague. And he makes his rebuttal and his response entirely on religious and cultural grounds. He does not discuss geostrategy primarily, which tells you something about the nature of the discussion that was going on. The only bit that was geostrategic that was being pushed at the time that seems to be very prominent in the discussions was the question of getting the United States involved in the war. And Zionists in particular in Britain were advocating this idea that somehow if Britain were to pass the Balfour Declaration, that would induce influential Zionists in the United States to try to get President Wilson to come in and join the war effort. Now, of course, that's an entirely silly logic, but it had some currency at the time. I don't think anybody in their right mind will believe that the United States would join something as momentous and huge as the First World War on the basis of a couple of Zionist figures like Louis Brandeis and Felix Frankfurter trying to influence President Wilson. But that's the only discussion that seemed to have gained some currency in the British cabinet at the time, which tells you something about their anti-Semitism, their view that somehow Jews were so influential in the U.S. as to be able to influence a conversation in that direction. And also, of course, their view that Jews are a unified monolithic bloc that were united behind Zionism, which of course was far from true. And they knew that from the British case, because of course the majority of the mainstream British Jewish leadership at the time was opposed to the Balfour Declaration and opposed to the idea of creating a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. So characters like Balfour, like Lloyd George, it's important to call out their crimes in relation to the Palestinian people. More importantly and significantly, it's important to call out the crimes of Winston Churchill, who really played the worst role in this whole saga. And he was very influential after the war was won and after Britain took control over Palestine, because he was the Secretary of the Colonies. And as Secretary of the Colonies, he played a major role in getting the League of Nations to pass a Palestine mandate in the way it was developed, and to create terms of the mandate that were geared towards enshrining into law the idea of creating a Jewish national homeland in Palestine, but also that put Britain in a position where it was, required to facilitate that project and to ensure, and I'm quoting here the terms of the mandate, to ensure, quote unquote, a close colonization on the land. And also, he made sure that he introduced the Jewish Agency as a major player in the equation, while, of course, excluding Palestinian leadership from any discussions on Palestinian political future. So he comes into a territory that has a majority Palestinian Arab population and forces upon it a thoroughly anti-democratic logic, but also a settler colonial logic. And interestingly, of course, Churchill celebrated this settler colonial logic. When he talking about Palestine, he referenced actually genocides that took place in the so-called Americas and in Australia. and he was thinking about those cases explicitly. And he compared Palestinians and other indigenous groups to a dog in the manger that was just sitting there, lying there, but has no claim over the space that they're lying in. Because, and I'm quoting him here, a superior race, a higher grade race came in to take their place. So it's a very racialized vision. So we see here an intersection between racialized visions, religious messianic visions, and various other calculations that were designed to control people like the Palestinian people. And Palestine.
Just because this is a really interesting point. I mean, to get back to the reference of what's going on today, and because I want to make this comparison and see how much has actually changed and how much is continuous. Because we talk about, people like you, historians going to talk about that Nakba is not wasn't an event that happened in 1948. It's this kind of continuous event, and now we're seeing perhaps the culmination of this kind of of something that began in many decades ago. So in this international dimension that I'm asking specifically about, so when somebody like Antony Blinken shows up after the first few days after October 7th and goes to Tel Aviv and says, I'm here first as a Jewish person, before coming as a foreign secretary, I'm here as a Jewish person. And you were talking about Montague and you're talking about Balfour and these kinds of people. What is that, the relationship in this case between the kind of the main power, the Americans in this case, personified through somebody like Blinken, who's not such a significant person. I mean, he's really a low-level kind of person as far as I can tell, but still comes in and represents a certain slice, a certain kind of part of what has kept the American-Israeli relationship going so strongly. And on the other hand, what was going on with the British, much earlier on. Is it the same thing, or because you're saying there wasn't much discussion of geopolitics or strategy, during the British discussions during Balfour's time, was mostly kind of cultural and religious, and now Blinken comes and says, "Well, I'm here as a Jewish person first." So you've got that kind of culturous, religious, apparently, dimension that was void even at that early stage of a kind of strategic, tactical thing. It was just purely a civilizational, cultural thing. So what is it that's changed? Or is it the same? I don't know. Maybe it's not changed.
So I think there's a lot that is the same. I mean, one thing that is the same is, of course, the overall imperial interest in this region, and I'm not discounting structure and structural policies when I'm talking about the specificity of Zionism here, and of the specificity of support for Zionism, because of course the British Empire had designs on Palestine. Of course, it did want to control the Suez Canal, but it didn't need to set up a settler colonial project to do that. It already had control over Palestine by the end of 1917 and the beginning of 1918. So we have a situation where they have control over the entire region, in fact. And of course, they did have designs on Palestine for geostrategic reasons. Most importantly, having control over the port of Haifa for the transport of Iraqi oil, and of course securing the area east of Suez under British rule. So, but again, that did not need a settler colonial project to be set up. In fact, once you set up a settler colonial project, you limit the ability of the empire to act freely. That's the lesson, actually, in all imperial realities. Empires have more freedom of movement when they control a space directly without the mediation of a settler colonial group. We know this from South Africa. We know this from so-called Rhodesia, that later became Zimbabwe. We know this from Algeria. Settler colonial groups are intransigent. They can sometimes be a headache for the imperial country, and that happened, of course, in Palestine itself, when the settler colonial group decided to rebel against their imperial sponsors in the 1940s. But So that's what when I'm talking about the structural factor versus the cultural factor. I'm not saying there's no imperial interest in this part of the world, but imperial interests are designed on a regional scale, whereas settler colonial interests, in particular when it comes to places like Palestine, are specific to a narrow strip of land, in this case, a very small and tiny one, and one that does not have the most important resources that the empire was trying to control. This is not Iraq, and it's not Egypt, okay, and it's certainly not the Gulf, which they had their eye on for of course the petroleum. So it's important to see the place of something like Palestine within imperialism, but to also take note of, again, the fact that Zionism is a powerful social and political movement, and that's a continuum that we see. That's what allows for this linkage between past and present to continue. The same forces that were advocating for Zionism in the early 20th century have expanded in the later part of the 20th century. They managed to achieve hegemony over the major Jewish political and cultural institutions. That does not mean that all Jews subscribe to that ideology. In fact, one of the most wonderful things that we're seeing in recent mobilizations is a clear crystallization of anti-Zionist Jewish thought in the West. However, that's coming from the grassroots. It's not coming from the top. The top is where the problem is at. The ordinary people are human beings who think and believe and have values and morals. And when they see a genocide unfolding, and when they see people getting expelled and destroyed, they of course object to that. So Blinken is a representation of this crisis of democracy at the top in all of these countries. Their inability to actually connect with human beings, or respect human beings, or value human beings, regardless of their background. These are the same forces that developed racialized systems in the United States and elsewhere. And let's not forget, none of these people put people first in their way of thinking. Biden was involved.
Yeah, sorry. I just on this the point you made a couple of minutes ago about the intrinsic value of the land itself, and hence to go back to Karim's question, the kind of cultural slash religious slash political imperatives rather than geostrategic ones. It's true that what distinguishes Palestine as opposed to other sites of settler colonial intervention, like the Americas, like Australia, which had vast areas of land that could function as a kind of reserve, like a place where the mother colony the mothership could offload segments of its population to transfer its own population to settle them, and as opposed to places like South Africa, which have vast resources in terms of gold and diamonds and uranium and minerals, as opposed to the Gulf, as opposed to the Iraq and so on. Palestine doesn't have any of those things. Really, its only function is that it occupies this kind of political, historical, cultural set of infusions and nexuses, really, in that sense. And perhaps also that's what distinguishes the Zionist settler colonial project in terms of geostrategic interest from those other ones. But also, this is something that I think my brothers want to take us to eventually in this conversation. Perhaps also that's what helps us understand why America's own interests, colonial interests or imperial interests, are not exactly at stake in Palestine in the way that, let's say, the British were concerned with Suez or concerned with the Gulf, because they had to do with India in some sense, at least in the 19th century. I don't know. I just want to make that point in passing, and then hand it back off to my brothers. But I think it's a super important point you're making there in passing.
No, I agree with you, obviously, 100%, sorry, on this. And I think that it's a very significant point that has to be reasserted, because you have people who try to deny the existence of this idea of Palestine as the Holy Land, as an important idea in this whole conversation, which is ridiculous. This you just have to go back to the earliest Zionist congresses, and actually the Bible of the Zionist movement, the Jewish State, which was authored by, of course, Theodore Herzl. And Theodor Herzl in that book considers Palestine versus what he calls Argentine, which is of course Argentina today. And he says when talking about Argentina, he talks about the resources and the potential and the vast territory. He's considering it as the option for setting up a Jewish state there. When he talks about Palestine, he focuses on the mobilizational capacity in relation to Jewish populations in Europe. He says this is, that this idea of Palestine will mobilize people and will ensure, therefore, the success of this push to recruit as many settler colonists as possible. Now, why did they need this idea? It's precisely because actually the majority of European Jews were not mobilized in favor of the idea of leaving Europe for Argentina or for Palestine. And in fact, when the first Zionist Congress was supposed to take place, as you all know, it was supposed to happen in Munich, but the Munich Jewish community prevented it from happening. They thought this is a dangerous and heretical group that is threatening Jewish interests in Europe, and that's why the first Zionist Congress had to happen in Basel. They had to move the venue. So that tells you something about the resistance to Zionism that had existed at the time. But the idea of Palestine was important for Zionists to be able to mobilize both Jews and also European non-Jews, particularly European Christians, for supporting a settler colonial project. And that's why, by the way, when you look at the terms of the mandate, they're also quite incredible. They start with a preamble that asserts, and this is an international document, this is a great powers assembled. They start by a preamble that asserts the so-called historic connection between Jews and this land. And now when you talk to any of these policymakers anywhere, they'll start with some, of course, ahistorical, in fact, anti-historical assertion of this so-called historical connection, which of course denies thousands of years of history and creates a notion that negates Jewish existence outside of this territory. And by doing so, actually, it's driven by anti-Semitic logic, of course, and more importantly, by anti-Palestinian logic.
I just also want to connect that as well with what we talked about last session, Osama, which was also how, in the UN debates, the partition debates, so in addition to the Jewish, the kind of supposed Jewish history that goes back, is also the question of, connecting it to the refugees during World War II. So if that didn't work, then there's the proximate connecting to the refugees, and that's what then allows the partition to kind of pass through. So as well, so there's these different international mechanisms to ensure that however you turn around, the Jewish question is put onto Palestine and the Arabs and the Palestinians in particular to kind of deal with.
So Abed, on this note, on what Karim is saying, and in terms of both 1947 and Blinken, and if I understand, just for our viewers and listeners, you're saying that people like Blinken and Balfour are important in the sense that they are these individuals that work within structures, but nevertheless have a certain sort of capacity that we need to understand and appreciate as well. But the question that all our viewers and listeners, I'm sure, are thinking about now is that, and this takes us, I want to segue to a second section here, but that you're absolutely right that Zionism, the colonial Zionism, the Zionist project in Palestine is, of course, a settler colonial project. We know that. On the other hand, we're talking about 2024, Abed, 2023, 2024, in terms of the genocide now taking place. So what distinguishes, there's a huge time lag, there's a century, or more than a century, between what you're talking about in terms of Algeria, in terms of the Americas, in terms of Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. All those things are deep, like not deep in the past. We're talking about 19th, 20th century even, but not 21st century. How do you explain this current situation that we're in terms of how does a historian work, and how do you help our viewers link this past to this present in terms of all the laws that have been put in place before? So the 1948 Genocide Convention is 1948. We're talking about 2024, and there's a genocide taking place. The Americas was before the Genocide Convention. The Holocaust was before the Genocide Convention. There's a reason why the genocide. Do you see what I'm saying? How do you explain that? And then I want to segue to a question that often comes up in our discussions with many of our colleagues and friends and listeners and viewers, which is the question of Arab politics, because I think I want to segue us to the thing that you really do work on, and you've made huge contributions, which is oftentimes people look at what's going on now in Gaza and they're shocked and horrified. by Arab state sort of inaction or complicity or duplicity or whatever it is that you want to describe it as, the shocking sort of Arab state politics right now. And then, but in the 50s, people often then think that the Arab states have never done anything, and the Arab, that there's always this tension between Arabs and Palestinians. How do you help us think about that historically? So two questions. One, the chronology. Palestine is happening now. It's not 19th century. Why is that significant? Two, what about Arab politics now as opposed to in the 1950s and 1960s? So those are two big questions.
I think they're very important questions, and I'll start by referring to the first. I think it's very important to consider what is a continuum and what changes. Okay, so I think what is continuous from the very beginning is the ideological aspect of Zionism, which is its idea that there is a need to set up a Jewish state in this part of the world, and they'll do anything to make that happen. So Zionists are committed to that principle. It is not something that changes in Zionist ideology. It is the core principle of that ideology. Okay, so that will continue regardless of the historical moment we're in. It's gonna continue now. It happened before. They'll continue further down, and any future reiterations of Zionism will focus on that principle. So,
but we have, Abed, now, sorry to interrupt, but we have now, we had allegedly after World War II a liberal order, human rights, genocide convention, so
yes,
on. So in other words, the Western support, yeah, okay. So
I'm coming to that. So there are the hardcore, there's a hardcore ideological aspect, and there are several important characters that are still, functioning today that are committed to that. So somebody like Blinken, he's very proud that his father had a role, and he even aggrandizes his role in setting up the Israeli state. He talks about his father's lobbying and his father's activities in that direction. These things are inherited. People are socialized into these things. They grew up in settings where the idea of contribution to setting up a settler colonial reality in Palestine is celebrated. So you have that dimension there. There's also the institutional element. Institutions that are committed to this project have actually not weakened; they've grown in the West as the years went by, and they've grown partly through adapting to the changing logics of the international order. So if we look at the early 20th century, when they were advocating Zionism, they were appealing to the most racist aspects of Europe. They were talking about the mission civilisatrice. The Zionist project is acting as a bulwark against the Asian menace. They were focusing on Islamophobic elements. They were focusing on even anti-Semitic dimensions, that this would relieve Europe of its European Jewish population, and so on and so forth. Now, as time went by, they've adjusted their logic. So you look at what happens, and this is why what happens in the partition plan is so important. What they do with the partition plan is they get the UN, and by they I mean the great powers that were invested in this project, as well as their Zionist supporters, and of course the Zionist settler colonists. They created a situation where the settler colonial state was set up through the United Nations. And that's quite extraordinary. Of course, it's not the United Nations that we know today, but it was the United Nations in its earliest iteration. It did not include many Afro-Asian voices. And of course, it went against the wishes of these Afro-Asian nations that were represented at the time, but for the most part. And we ended up with a situation where the UN actually inserts this, decides that it's going to set up a settler colony. This is, by the way, the only time in history where the UN set up a settler colony. It's accepted settler colonies into membership before, but in this case, they actually set up a settler colony. And I want our listeners to think about that. It's quite an extraordinary fact. Once you've set it up as a
sorry,
settler colony,
by the way, Abed, sorry, and just to connect to something that we've said on this podcast before, Karim made the point. I think it was in our last, anyway, it was in a recent episode. Karim pointed out that there's no way that the partition plan would have gone through, I mean, as he says, even the few third world countries that were members of the UN at that point voted against it for the most part. But had this come in the 50s or 60s after the wave of decolonization, there's no way it would have gone through. And it sort of represents the kind of last gasp of the old colonial order. It's a point that Karim makes very powerfully, I think.
Yeah, if it came like 3 years later, even, it would have been a different world. I mean, you have also a situation where the Soviet and Eastern Bloc made certain decisions at the time that were very anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab, and were geared towards setting up this reality. And of course, had it come in the 50s, that would have changed. But by the way, it was a very narrow decision. Had it not been for the Eastern Bloc supporting it, had it not been for the bullying of a couple of Asian states, I mean, the Philippines did not want to vote in favor of this. Haiti did not want to vote in favor of this. They were bullied. They were literally bullied into reversing their earlier votes. So of course it would have been a different outcome. But why is this significant? It's because once you've admitted a settler colonial state like this into the so-called international order, which is really the order that was set up by the victors of the Second World War. It's not the international order. It's the order of the victors of the Second World War, which means the former dominant European imperial powers, defeating the European powers that were aspiring imperialists, like Germany and others. Of course, these aspiring imperialists were also genocidal in Europe. They're nasty people, but this is the reality of what was going on. So we have that kind of reality going on as far, if you want to read it from an Afro-Asian perspective. And these powers come in with their settler colonial offshoots in the Western Hemisphere and create a new settler colony. By doing so, they've afforded the Zionists access to a new language, which is the language of protecting state sovereignty. And suddenly, we have to now talk as Palestinians. We have to defend why we have a claim on our own land. Because they'll tell you, oh, look, you're trying to eliminate an existing state. You're trying to eliminate the state of Israel. So they'll use the statist logic, and suddenly you have to grapple with that. They'll use the logic that you were a rejectionist. They'll tell you, well, you had the option of accepting this plan. Since when does any colonized group in history accept the setting up of a settler colonial state? By the way, this is why, and I'm saying this in my new book, it's a misnomer to call it the Partition Resolution. I refuse that name. It is not a partition resolution. It's a resolution to set up a settler colonial state in Palestine. And it should be understood as such. And it was understood as such by Palestinians and by the Arab delegates and by other Asian delegates at the time. They knew exactly what was happening. So the statist logic that you talked about, Osama, now, they promoted, it's different than the logic that they were promoting before. They stopped talking in colonialist terms that are brazen. They do it in a hidden way now, and they use all these Orientalist tropes to facilitate that.
Human animals. The Israelis use civilizational racist logic. You're talking about the West, you mean?
I'm talking about the West.
Yeah, you're right. Right.
The Israelis also use different logics for different audiences. A lot of that civilizational logic is used for internal mobilization purposes, and then they'll use other logics for external communities. They'll use pinkwashing, they'll use greenwashing, they'll use all sorts of. They'll use human rights language. Of course, let's not forget that they're very good at adapting to also whatever is the fashionable imperialist parlance of the day, like the war on terror, which has been a disaster for Palestinians, especially in Gaza now. The whole genocide is premised, the support, Western support for the genocide is premised on this idea that this is a war against a terrorist group, which is, of course, not what is happening in Gaza. And of course, this is a total misreading of what is going, a willful misreading of what's going on. But it's part of the logic of genocide promotion that is taking place now.
So, Abdel, can you help us now in terms of thinking about the Arab world and the Arab state politics today versus the 1950s? Because again, you've been at the forefront of trying to excavate and remind our listeners and viewers and your readers, for that matter, of the fact that Arab states were not always the way they are today. And there's often this conflation. People just, oh, the Arab states hate the Palestinians, or Abdel Nasser hated the Palestinians. Can you educate our listeners and viewers about both what is happening today, but also what's happened in the 1950s, and like how do we make sense of the shift?
There's a saying in Arabic, it's very common in the Arab world, which is الأمركة تساوي الأسرة. Americanization equals Israelization, and that's actually like an important thing to understand. So when we want to think about how Arab states behave now in contrast to how they behaved earlier, that's very much connected to that. Now, of course, in the 1950s, the Arab states had come out of liberation struggles, independence struggles. These were newly independent states. They were, for the most part, governed by either states that had been, by political groups that had been under the control of the old imperial powers, but were adjusting to a new reality of independence, or groups that managed to overthrow the former clients of the imperial powers, and were taking an even more radical approach that rejected the idea of alignment. So the question in the 50s was, of course, a question of alignment, but there was consensus on opposing Zionism, because even those groups that had collaborated with the imperial powers before, the Hashemites in Jordan and Iraq, the Al Saud in Saudi Arabia, the different Gulf sheikhs, the Senussis in Libya, the Egyptian royal family, all of these different groups had no interest in supporting Zionism. It had no added value for them. Their only interest was to have a relationship with the imperial power of the day, and to have their vision was Arab independence with connection to the old imperial powers, and floating in the Western orbit. That was their main vision. It's a conservative vision. It was rejected by a newly emerging set of social forces that carried out coups or revolutions in Egypt, in Iraq, and in later on in different Arab countries, and that also created, of course, a long-standing set of battles over alignment with the West, and that in general managed to confront the project which had existed in the 1950s, which is to absorb the region into an anti-Soviet communist bloc, but also one that would strike peace agreements with the Israeli state. For the most part, this succeeded in the 50s. And it succeeded because of the balance of power at the time. There was the Soviet Union. I'll give you an example. Egypt, it could not have taken an unaligned route. It could not have withstood the American pressures to normalize the existence of a settler colonial state in the 1950s, and to force Palestinian refugees into resettlement as opposed to repatriation, which has always been their principle and what they've been demanding, to this very day. And what was happening in the 50s was that there was pressure on the Egyptian government to adopt these lines, and of course to fall into the Western orbit. But it had the option of getting weapons from elsewhere. They could arm their military through access to the Czech arms deal, which was of course facilitated by the Soviets. They could fund their development projects through also appealing to that other bloc, and therefore they could have some space for maneuver. That no longer existed, and it progressively declined, as the years went by. So it became clear that the dominant imperial powers, which of course have a vested interest in Zionism, became dominant in this region, and by that I mean the United States primarily. As it becomes more and more dominant in the region, it pushes a set of requirements on the regimes that come under its control, or that operate within its orbit of influence. And the requirement is to either take a totally quietist position in relation to the Israeli state, or to even go in a more extreme collaborationist path with it, where they conspire against the Palestinian people. And that conspiring against the Palestinian people means denying the Palestinian right to return. So again, pushing for resettlement as opposed to repatriation. It means denying the Palestinian right to freedom and liberty and self-determination under whatever formula, but one that would guarantee political and national rights for the Palestinian people. And we see this in operation today. So the new developments have to do with the American dominance in the region. They don't have to do with actual preferences of local elites with the region.
So, Abed, just a quick clarification before I turn it to Karim. Is there a specific turning point that when you say that there's a shift, is it 67? Is it post-Cold War? And then I know Karim has a question and a follow-up, but is there just for our listeners and viewers, is there a specific moment you're thinking of where this shift takes place?
There's an accumulation of moments. 67, creates a situation where within the Egyptian free officers, there are some that start believing in the American option. That was not the position of the dominant person in that ruling bloc, which was Jamal Abdel Nasser, and he of course tried to reconstruct the Egyptian army, and he was trying to regain Egyptian territory through rebuilding the military capacity of the Egyptian state, which of course Sadat follows in his footsteps initially in that direction, but deep down at heart he believed that the Soviets are weaker, and that the Americans are the dominant power, and both economically and militarily. And remember, there are again contributing factors to this. 67 happens. Who funds Egyptian reconstruction after 67? It's not the Soviets. They don't have the money for it. Even before that, by the way, the Soviets throughout the 60s were encouraging Egypt to not fully cut its relations with the United States and to be careful with that, because they told them, we can't fund your food program, for example, if you cut those relations. We don't have the money for that. They could provide military support. They could provide limited development support. But at the end of the day, these are developing countries with needs. After 67, these needs become huge and enormous. A place like Egypt needed to reconstruct, it needed to rebuild its army. It was very expensive. Algeria contributed through its oil resources. Initially they made a big payment for the Soviets to rebuild the Egyptian army, but of course the bulk of the money came from Saudi Arabia, and that required achieving rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. So already you had a shift regionally where the governments that came out of the radical revolt against the order that was established by the imperial powers, by the withdrawing imperial powers in the early 1950s, had to now readjust to that order and had to work with forces that they had considered to be thoroughly reactionary only a few years before. So that's where the importance of 67 cannot be underemphasized. But more so, you had an ideological shift happening within this domain. Somebody like Sadat was an opportunist. He believed that he could open up Egyptian markets for investment through dropping the Palestine cause, through putting all his eggs in the American basket. And he saw this idea as an opportunity to basically get a better deal for Egypt, or what he thought to be a better deal for Egypt and for himself, of course, through alignment with the U.S. And that's why Camp David was such a destructive thing that was imposed on the Palestinian people. It was a horrific act because it meant that instead of the Arab bloc operating as a bloc, you had the most important country militarily that has borders with the Israeli state signing a peace agreement. And by the way, think about this. It's the president claimed to be most liberal around Palestine and that had the most concern with the Palestinian people that facilitated that. Jimmy Carter, he spent years afterwards talking about Israel and peace, not apartheid, and all of that. But he created the reality, the horror that we're living in today, by structurally, allowing for a separate Egyptian agreement that marginalized the Palestinian people and destroyed our negotiating position even further.
Abed, this is fascinating. I want to get back to the question of this kind of the relationship, in a sense, between the Arab states and the Palestinian kind of national leaderships. From those days, let's say from the creation of the PLO, Fatah, but PLO really under the Arab League, under Abdel Nasser, and how that evolved. So the relationship between the Arab states, or the dominant Arab states, and the kind of at that point emerging kind of national Palestinian leaderships. Yasser Arafat kind of as he takes over and kind of steers it through the 80s and then into the early 90s. How does that relationship change? You talk now about Sadat, and sort of maybe Sadat and Camp David is maybe the end of that 1967 phase and the beginning of what then came all these kinds of peace agreements that we're seeing all the way till now to the kind of Abraham Accords. It kind of set a new tone. And within those tones, within those kinds of, let's say, waves of normalization that started with Sadat onwards, it's punctuated by these incredible acts of resistances, including very violent resistances from time to time. And that then resets what can be normalized, who can normalize, what the relationship between that normalizing state is vis-a-vis their public, vis-a-vis their international kind of status. So, and we see it today. We're talking, when the Americans and others are talking about this post-Hamas, post kind of Gaza genocide, the day after kind of discussions, we start seeing, we want to get the Palestinian Authority back in. And okay, who does the Palestinian Authority represent internationally? Who does it represent regionally? What's the connection between this guy with the UAE and the other guy with Saudi and the third guy with Egypt? And, so it's a bit like, in Lebanon, we have the same thing. Oh, who does this guy represent? He represents the other person, this international sponsor, the other international sponsor. So this relationship between, we talk about Hamas today, but it was Fatah, it was the PLO then in the previous times. There was the first Intifada, second Intifada. So you have all these resistances that I think anyway kind of reset the relationship between these kind of larger Arab and even international patrons that kind of come and go. How do you see that relationship as it evolved over these past few decades between the Palestinian leaderships, let's say, and the kind of larger Arab kind of regional powers?
So Kareem, I hate doing this, but we'll have to go a little bit earlier than the setting up of the PLO. As a historian, that's the problem with hosting somebody with a historically minded orientation. So if we go back to the question of Arab states in Palestine, it really starts with the 1936 revolt. So you have a situation where the British did not allow for Palestinian representation, but of course they created recognition for surrounding Arab states under the mandate system. And that means something for the Palestinian ability to represent the Palestinian people. That becomes a long-standing pattern. And it creates actually a set of traumas for Palestinian political actors historically. Because you have figures that are promoted by the imperial powers and their agenda is for them to represent Palestinians. In that period, it was King Abdullah, or previously Emir Abdullah and later King Abdullah. Of course, you have Abdel Aziz Al Saud. You have different characters that are promoted initially. We see this becoming a major problem, an even bigger problem during the Nakba, because of course, during the Nakba, the Palestinians had a problem in terms of being able to mobilize and defend their homeland against the ethnic cleansing that was taking place, and they needed weapons to do that, and they needed military training. And here that meant that they needed support from the newly independent Arab states around them. But by now, these newly independent Arab states included ones that were totally under British control, like the King Abdullah in Jordan. They also included states that, like Syria, that were still floating in the British orbit at the time, and although they had they wanted to support Palestine, but it was they were also weak, and they had their own complications. Included Hashemite Iraq, which was in the British orbit, included Egypt, included Saudi Arabia, and what ended up happening is that these states ended up disarming the Palestinians rather than arming them, even though they made decisions to arm them. But we know that, as the Palestinian national leadership tried to create local armed militias on the ground, the Arab states introduced a different kind of army of volunteers from outside. This was before the British withdrawal.
We're talking about late 30s. We're talking about late 30s or early 40s.
No, we're talking about right after the partition resolution was passed in
1947, 48. Okay.
Yeah. So you have a dual situation happening, where you have military groups that are pushed by the Arab states, and then of course local militias that are developed by the Palestinian leadership under the Mufti primarily. Okay. Now, what happens is that causes chaos and an inability to defend Palestine, but also creates a political vacuum that is used by the Zionist movement. Because if you have an Arab state like Jordan, in this case, saying we do not want to promote the idea of Palestinian independent representation, then you cannot have an effective Palestinian response to the announcement of an Israeli state in 1948. And you can't have an armed effective response. And indeed, once Britain withdraws, the minute it withdraws, actually, the Jordanian army, for example, when it enters the West Bank, it removes the weapons that are held there by the local militias that were connected to the Palestinian leaderships. So it demobilizes and disarms the local population. Similarly, the Egyptian army actually disarmed any groups that it did not see as fitting in within its agenda. So, and then, you have an attempt at independent Palestinian political representation, the All-Palestine government, but it quickly gets absorbed into Arab dynamics, and it gets marginalized because the only backing for it happens from the Egyptian side, and with conditions, by the way. They want to control it. And in the meantime, of course, the Jordanians reject it, and they ensure that it fails. So the PLO comes in, 15 years later. And it comes in out of a situation where it was clear that the Palestinian communities across the region had mobilized into underground clandestine political parties that had either one of two directions. One was either revolutionary parties that wanted to change the whole regional map. So they were Baathists, they were Arab nationalists, they were communists, and in some cases, of course, Muslim Brotherhood or Hizb al-Tahrir types. There was that Islamic dimension on the margin, and then you had a different current, which was the what became Fatah later on, which was saying, okay, we don't want to interfere in the internal politics of the Arab states, but we do not want any interference from them, and that was very much modeled on the Algerian model. So they thought, we're going to create a Palestinian FLN. The role of Arab states will be to support it, but they should not go beyond supporting it. They should not make policies on behalf of the Palestinian people. So those two currents are the major currents that develop, and both of them do not accord with the overall Arab policy at the time. Now, Jamal Abdel Nasser, after the fall of his unity program with Syria and the United Arab Republic, and after the war in Yemen, and after all the disasters that happened, he had admitted actually that, and he said this openly in 1962, there is no Arab plan to liberate Palestine. Okay, And he was pretty forthcoming about that. He needed a structure that would take the pressure off from the Arab states and allow for the energy that is developing on the Palestinian arena, energy that he thought could be very dangerous for these Arab states because they're next to the Israeli settler colony and they're worried about its aggression. So he wanted a body that he could work with that would represent the Palestinian cause, but within parameters that do not threaten the overall regional order. So that's why you had the development of the PLO with Egyptian state backing at the time, and with Nasser putting his weight behind it.
But I would just to clarify for our leaders, for our listeners and viewers, Fatah was founded before, correct?
Fatah was founded before, and Clandestine Palestinian Action was founded before. So Clandestine Palestinian Action started immediately after the Nakba.
Yes, it's important just for our viewers because oftentimes people think the PLO was founded by the Egyptian state, to control the Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. But you're saying it's important to remind our viewers that there was a whole realm of independent action before, and Fatah was before.
Yes, and it's important to remind our viewers that it's not just about controlling Palestinians, the founding of the PLO under Nasser. Nasser actually wanted a body that represents Palestinians. It was not just a cynical agenda, but he wanted a body that would operate within the respectable parameters that he had set. He wanted a diplomatic body, a body that could mobilize regional energies in sync with Egyptian policy. But it's not just about control; it's also about representation.